During the month of August, we're going to take a look at some of the various themes that predominated the General Council meeting which was held in Oshawa in July, right near the end of July. And so the information is coming out, and we heard last week from our guest speaker, Jim, and he gave an overall flavor of some of the things. But I decided, because I'm going to try to do this, okay? I can't lead the clapping, but maybe I can have PowerPoints for my sermon so that those who want to see things and remember in that way will be able to see things. So that's a picture of what the General Council was set up. The General Council meeting was set up like, and there was 360 delegates, commissioners, they're called, from across the country who met at the national meeting to give shape to the direction that the United Church as a national body is going. Next slide. They elected Richard Bott. Now he's most recently, he served at Dunbar United Church in Vancouver, and they have just successfully completed an amalgamation with Ryerson United in Vancouver. And folks were having this big conversation at Dunbar and at Ryerson, whether or not it should be Ryerson and Dunbar United Church or Dunbar Ryerson United Church. And you know what? The young people came up the center and they said, let's call it Pacific Spirit United Church. And Pacific Spirit United Church it is. And so Richard was one of the ministers involved in that very successful amalgamation of two long-time established churches in Vancouver. So he comes on to with a message that the United Church is ready for change. We have experienced the kind of decline as a church and as a denomination that's happening through nationally. And we've been kind of stunned and almost filled with inertia about how to respond to something that we never imagined would happen. But Richard came with a message that now people are seeing that if the church is not to just decline into oblivion, it will be because we take risks and dare to have faith in a new generation of what church will look like. So that's a message that he brings, and he is very articulate and will speak on that for his 3-year term as a moderator. Now good. Jim spoke yesterday. Jim spoke last Sunday about the new way they did business. Have you ever heard, when you've been in a business meeting, that it's much easier for some people to get up to the microphone and debate a point than it is for other people? Have you ever felt disadvantaged because you weren't one of those people who could get up and in 2 succinct moments make your point and be articulate and glowing? And so you just stayed in your seat, even though you had something of value to say? So the United Church and the General Council said, we are missing too many voices. We are missing too many of our own voices. And so they changed the process. And the first thing people did was, when they had a report to make, people listened to them make the report, talk about a direction that they were going. And people could ask clarifying questions. That's all you could do. You couldn't debate it. You listened. You got it as clear as you could. Then they broke into, the next section was they went into discussion groups. And in these discussion groups, they had free-flowing conversation with their 360 commissioners. I believe they had something like 13 or 16 discussion groups. And there were people at the discussion groups who were listening. And they collected all the points of wisdom, the points pro and the points against, new ways that were talked about. And then they went to this facilitation group. And all the groups got to have their input into this facilitation group. And so what one group didn't think of, another group did. The facilitation group worked just about all night, several times. 3 o'clock was not unusual. So this is people like Marion Best who are in this facilitation group, eh? So, you know, I bet you Marion's used to going to bed before 3 o'clock in the morning. She lives down in Naramata, but, anyway, that whole group worked very hard. And they said, this is what we've seen. This is what we have heard. And they revised the proposal that had been under discussion to take into consideration the wisdom that had come from everybody. And only then did it come to the whole plenary session. And at the plenary session, they asked 2 or 3 questions. They said, first off, folks, did the facilitation group hear your point? Do you hear your views represented in what is presented? And 90% or more of the time, people said, yes, I see my views. Sometimes their views were not agreed with. Now that's different than not being heard. So, and it was recognized that sometimes other groups had just not agreed with a particular point. So the second question was, folks, are you willing, believing that we have heard the discussion, even though it's not happened in the big community, are you ready to vote? And again, if it was 90%, they said, okay, yes, we're ready to vote. And they voted. And it worked very, very well. And I think the analysis is that it's going to be great. So, a couple of issues. They talked about, would they have full communion? That is, have full recognition on the sacraments, on the ministry, folks, on the way you deal with clergy, with the disciples of Christ. Now that's a church that has 27 congregations in Ontario and is largely an American church. And it has more congregations down in the U.S., but this full communion recognition with both Canadian and U.S. Disciples of Christ churches, it passed. So, if you folks wanted to, when you're tired of me, you could hire a Disciples of Christ church. church minister, right? Don't do that soon. So, restructuring, this council, a huge theme of it was the restructuring of the United Church so that we would be nimble enough and flexible enough and lean enough to grow into the times that the church is now facing. So, restructuring into 3 courts was accepted, and effective December 31st, all the presbyteries disappear. So we'll have a little party to say goodbye to Victoria Presbytery, and it'll be no more. Next slide, please. There's a new financial model, and it used to be that presbytery was the one that gave us the allocation. Well, if they're going to disappear, they don't want the allocation to disappear with them. So now the General Council is going to assess 4.5% of every budget of the congregations in the United Church, and they're going to manage the finances of the church. You'll remember when I was called here that Carol Martin from Presbytery worked diligently with the search committee to find a minister to help St. Aidan's do your discerning and figure out your directions and that kind of thing. Well, not only will there not be Carol Martins because there won't be presbytery, they have started what's called the Office of Vocation. And this office, there will be a few centers throughout the country, and those will be the people who help congregations call ministers, who will keep a record of all the ministers who are available and that. So again, that's been somewhat centralized, and there'll be regional offices throughout the country. Next, please. So I want today to just quickly let you know of 4 items that were in the theme of the justice-seeking church. That's why we sang 4 Strong Winds. That's why we read the Matthew 25. That's why if I had a hammer, the kind of music that we wanted to sing was because there was a theme of justice that flowed through this. And it was reported that Ahad Tamimi, a Palestinian activist, she's 17 years old. Some of you may have seen the information when she was arrested and put into prison. There was a plea agreement. She assaulted 2 police officers on the day that her cousin had been shot in a protest action. So this is happening in Israel, Palestine, as people are trying to figure out how will that unfold. There is tremendous hope that this young woman has the articulateness, the lived experience, the capacity to be a leading voice for Palestinian freedom, for some direction where people will, for the Palestinian people. She's 17 years old. Kind of reminds you of Malala, doesn't it? Like, we have these remarkable young people who are seeing differently, are articulate and able to speak out. She's one of them. So when you see that and read about her in the paper and see her watch her on YouTubes and that, you can say, you know, she first came to my attention in Sunday worship. The General Council was asked, and people were asked, to support Bill C-81, which is the accessibility legislation that is being proposed here in Canada, that, you know, if you can't get around, if you're dependent on always for somebody to help you get around, the quality of your life in Canada, although it is better than many, many places in the world, is still difficult. A ledge that is nothing to us if we're able-bodied is really something to somebody in a wheelchair. And unless we have the eyes to see it, we don't notice it. So, the commissioners and the people throughout the church have been asked to speak to our MP and show our support for Bill C-81. Next slide, please. Well, no, Doug Ford was not at the General Council meeting. But the clergy in Ontario wrote him a letter and said that they were very heartened by the fact that he wanted to be the premier for all people. And so they wrote this letter together to talk about the values and the ways of society that are important to the United Church of Canada and to these clergy. Two things. You can read it online because it's a very well-written letter. It was heartily, the Ontario clergy were heartily supported by the General Council. But also, in every place where presbytery is disappearing, people started to say, whoa, could this be a new model for how things will happen in this new network that's happening, where clergy might get together, lay folks might get together and make their views known. So we're just struggling around with that. But the letter to Premier Ford was part of the justice theme of the General Council. The General Council had their picture taken when they were all, most of them were wearing black on a Thursday of the General Council to show their solidarity with people who are trying to work at gender-based violence and to make a difference. This really is the next step in the Me Too movement. And for folks, like the church had to acknowledge that the Me Too movement is not foreign in the church climate and the church communities. So a kind of a way of saying, yes, we are in solidarity. And so some of the pictures that you'll see coming out of General Council will be the huge group of people. And if you say, boy, they're all wearing black, that's why. Because we've been asked to support this theme, this movement, because we are in full communion partnership with the United Church of Christ in the U.S., and this is a campaign that they are initiating. So, if you ever feel like it, wear black on a Thursday. Well, there's more to it, but I didn't want to give you the whole thing because I want to talk to you next week about a different theme at General Council. But this is some of the things that are happening that our national church is talking about and is commending us to talk about. Right? So they've given us the leadership, and they're saying these are things that nationally people are telling us are important to one region or another or throughout the whole church. So if we want, we can kind of add our support and explore these same issues. Well, thank you very much for listening, for letting me share this part. And we've chosen the hymn, Make Me a Channel of Your Peace, as a way to sing about our longing and the world's longing that there would be justice with peace, or peace with justice.